Hello, PREETS representatives. Welcome to Module 1 of the Pre-Employment Transition Services training that has been designed especially for you. This training is the first module in a series of 6 that will take you through the basic information that you need to know in order to provide pre-employment transition services to students who are potentially eligible for the Vocational Rehabilitation Program. Module 1 will focus on background information. After completing all 6 modules, we ask that you complete the evaluation that will be linked in the final module. This is important since it will allow us to record that you completed the training, and it also gives us feedback for future training. The agenda for this module includes a welcome, a review of our changing VR program landscape, and an overview of transition services. My name is Alyssa Klein, and I serve as the VRS Transition and Pre-Employment Transition Services Specialist. My role is to support all of you with your training and resource needs. I also work at the state level on interagency coordination services between VRS, the Minnesota Department of Education, otherwise known as MDE, and the Department of Human Services, otherwise known as DHS. And I also lead initiatives that help improve our overall system for supporting the career development needs of youth with disabilities. I'm so thrilled to welcome those of you who are new to our agency, as well as to say hi to those who have been with us for a while and are viewing these modules as a refresher. The PREETS representative position within VRS is a crucial role in our VRS student career services. Please keep in mind that you can reach out to me anytime when you have questions, need extra support, or just have some ideas for system improvement. My job is to be of service to you, and my favorite part of my job is having connections with all of you. All right, so let's dig in. The first part of this module is to learn more about the public VR program and the addition of pre-employment transition services, or PREETS. So what is VRS? We are an employment service program for people with disabilities. We are funded by both state and federal funds. And in 2020, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the federal VR program, which began as a means to serve veterans who came home from World War I with injuries that impacted them going back to work. A major landmark for our program was the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which was essentially the first civil rights law for people with disabilities. It prohibited discrimination on the basis of disability in federal programs. The Rehab Act is embedded in the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2014, which is the most recent amendment of our federal law. VRS serves both high school students and adults at any age. For high school students, we have a counselor and a PREETS representative assigned to every high school and 18 to transition program in the state. Individuals no longer in high school can access our program through any of our VRS offices, which are part of the Minnesota Career Force system. Career Force is the branding for the public system that provides supports to people looking for work and businesses looking for workers. We are located in almost every Career Force location, but we have some standalone offices as well. So who we are. When it comes to serving high school students, again, we have counselors that serve students who are eligible for the public VR program, as well as PREETS representatives that serve students who are potentially eligible for VR. However, VRS is one program. Collectively, we provide student career services, otherwise known as PREETS, to all high school students we serve. This needs to be our unified, front-facing message to schools, students, families, and other stakeholders. It is why we have one set of marketing materials to students. VRS Student Career Services is a continuum of services. Of course, as PREETS representatives, you'll be providing the services to potentially eligible students, indicated as PE on this slide. As much as possible, we want pre-ET services to potentially eligible students, or PE, to be the first step for most service students referred to us who are in grades 9 through 11. These services get students started in our VRS Student Career Services. They also help us understand who needs more intensive VR services, as well as who has gotten all they need through this initial level of service. Step 2 is VR services for students that need more support. Pre-ETs are still provided to these students too, but other support services can be provided as well, and they can last until a young person reaches a successful employment outcome. Keep in mind that there should be no harm in getting any students started in PE services first. We can always help them apply for intensive VR services at any time if they need more. And there isn't a need to have schools, students, or families choose which type of service they apply for. As the default, have them start in PE services whenever possible. On the flip side though, if students or families ask to apply for VR, we also would never deny that option to them. It is important for you to understand that this graphic represents our ultimate agency goal, the most ideal situation. With the leadership of your RAM, your team will figure out the best way to implement a structure for serving each school in your region and how to handle the student referrals from each school. So as I noted earlier, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA, is our federal law that was signed in July of 2014. There are two key changes impacting youth with disabilities within WIOA that have dramatically changed the public VR program. Those changes include limitations on the use of sub-minimum wage and pre-ETs. The Rehabilitation Services Administration, or RSA, is the federal program that administers the VR program nationally. They tell us how we are to carry out the WIOA law through regulations that were posted in 2016. So we're not going to focus much attention in these training modules on the first item mentioned in the last slide, which is limitations on the use of sub-minimum wage, otherwise known as Section 511. However, it is important for you to understand a little bit about it. Entities that have traditionally been known as DTNHs or DACs or sheltered workshops can be certified by the federal government to pay people with disabilities less than minimum wage. WIOA has now restricted youth under the age of 25 from entering a sub-minimum wage without accessing VR first in order to reduce the tracking of young people into these types of settings without having the full opportunity to pursue competitive integrated employment first. WIOA Section 511 is influenced by the historic 1999 Olmstead decision made by the U.S. Supreme Court. This decision focuses on people with disabilities being offered integrated service options as much as possible versus service options in segregated settings. The woman in this picture is Lois Curtis, one of two individuals who sued the state of Georgia because she was forced to live in an institution rather than in the community. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Lois's favor, saying that it is illegal to force people with disabilities to be served in segregated settings if that is not necessary. Minnesota actually had its own similar lawsuit in 2011, and out of that decision, the federal courts required us to create a Minnesota Olmstead plan that was accepted in 2015. The vision of our plan is for people with disabilities have the right to live, learn, work, and enjoy life in the most integrated setting. As part of our Olmstead plan, the Minnesota Employment First policy was created in 2014. It notes that employment first means raising the expectation that all working age Minnesotans with disabilities can work, want to work, and can achieve competitive integrated employment, and that each person will be offered the opportunity to work and earn a competitive wage before being offered other supports and services. Within our Employment First policy, competitive integrated employment, otherwise known as CIE, is defined. So CIE means a regular job in the community where a person with a disability gets the same things that those without disabilities get. It can be full-time, part-time, or self-employment, and it can be with or without support. It must be in the competitive labor force, on the payroll of a competitive business or industry, and it must pay at least minimum wage, but not less than the customary wage. And people with disabilities should receive the same benefits as anybody else. So I review all of that information for you as a backdrop as your work as a PREETS representative. You'll be helping to set the stage for all young people with disabilities, including those with the most significant needs, to understand that we have high expectations for them. We are here to help them on their pathway to competitive integrated employment. So again, the next major item in WIOA is pre-employment transition services. All of the remaining information provided in these training modules is intended for you to understand PREETS. On this slide are the 5 required PREETS services, which are the primary services that you'll be providing. They include job exploration counseling, work-based learning experiences, post-secondary education counseling, workplace readiness training, and instruction in self-advocacy. This slide gives you some data so that you have some context about the scope of our services in Minnesota. The data here is the most recent that we have as of the time that this training was recorded, which is from the 2019-2020 school year. First, we have data about how many students ages 14 through 21 have disabilities in our state. There's a caveat to this, however. We know how many students are in special education or who have an IEP or individualized education program. That number was 4,562. We also get some data from the Minnesota Department of Education about the number of students who have a 504 accommodation plan. And by the way, I'm going to review a little more information about IEPs and 504 plans in a future training module. But school districts aren't required to keep accurate data on 504 plans. So the number of 9,302 is an underrepresentation. Furthermore, there are also students with disabilities who do not have an IEP or a 504 plan. And of course, there's no way of knowing exactly how many individuals that is. So we do know, however, that we have at least 50,000 students between the ages of 14 and 21 that have disabilities. And all of these students are potentially eligible for VR. Then we can take a look at our VRS program data from our 2019 program year, which ended on June 30th of 2020. You'll see that we served almost 8,000 youth aged 21 and under, and about 7,000 individuals aged 22 and over in our intensive VR program. Furthermore, we served 833 potentially eligible students. But keep in mind, this was just our first year of having PREETS representatives, so we expect the numbers of potentially eligible students served to continue increasing in the coming years. It is also important to know that WIOA requires VR programs to spend 15% of our federal funds on PREETS. In Minnesota, that comes to roughly $6.8 million a year. On this slide, I have a link to a page on our SharePoint site where you can see where we're at in this fiscal year with our spending. WIOA OA requires pre-ETS to be provided to students that you'll be serving, the students who are potentially eligible, and also that they are provided to students that are served in our VR program or those that the counselors serve. Each state in the country is required to translate the WIOA law and the RSA regulations within their own policy and guidance materials. You can find our full policy and guidance manual at the SharePoint link here. We have 21 chapters, with chapter 7 being of most relevance to you because it outlines our transition services, with pre-ETS being a part of those transition services. While transition is not new here in Minnesota, how and when transition services are provided to students may now look a little different since pre-ETS has been added to the continuum of transition services that VR can offer to students with disabilities. VR counselors have provided transition services to students in high school for many years, but prior to WIOA, our message essentially was that it is the school's responsibility to provide most of the services a student needs, and that we get involved primarily to get to know students, provide some counseling and guidance and consultation services, and then provide the bulk of services once a student graduates from high school. WIOA and the pre-ETS mandate means that VR programs across the country now need to focus more intently on providing services to students while they're in high school. So this new scope strengthens partnerships with schools to provide transition services to students with disabilities who are eligible for VR services. It creates opportunities for new partnerships with schools to provide or arrange for the provision of pre-ETS to any student with a disability who needs those services. It strengthens engagement of employers and providers in developing a continuum of work-based learning opportunities for students with disabilities in competitive integrated employment settings. And it requires VR agencies to conduct more outreach activities to students and families regarding VR transition services and pre-ETS in partnership with education. This slide reviews our course for pre-ETS implementation in Minnesota. So stage 1, I titled that Dipping Our Toes in the Water. So again, WIOA signed in 2014, but then we didn't get our regulations until 2 years later in 2016. The message that we had to VRS staff was just to start targeting more services to high school students. But then stage 2 began after we got the regulations, and I call that Let's Start Here. So once we had those regulations, we began providing services to potentially eligible students through 12 grants that were awarded by a competitive process to our community partners. VR counselors were also given the direction on how to provide pre-ETS to students who are eligible for VR. But then in 2019, we moved into stage 3, which I call a course correction, because we learned from RSA that we weren't allowed to grant funds and that we were required to have internal staff that oversaw the pre-ETS services to potentially eligible students. So the grants ended, and that's when we hired our first round of 20+ pre-ETS representatives. Furthermore, as a means to better partner with our provider community, we added pre-ETS to our professional and technical contracts, which we'll talk more about later. Then, moving forward, at the time that this training is being recorded in February of 2021, we're in the process of hiring 20 more pre-ETS representatives, almost doubling the number of those staff, in order to adequately serve that growing population of people we serve. So with all of that said, we're still in the process of building our pre-ETS system together. During the past few years, we have said we're in the infancy stages of the work. Upon putting this presentation together for all of you. I'm thinking, maybe we're moving more into the toddler years, but either way, we're still very young with the pre-ETS programming. And again, we're so excited about you coming on board and also about the important work you'll be doing. We want you to keep in mind that you're not alone in this work. Pre-ETS reps and counselors should be close partners in serving each school, and there are also RAMs, VR technicians, placement staff, and administrative team members like myself that are all here to help and support you. So for the remainder of this module, I want to review the world of transition and where pre-ETS fits into it. One way to look at it is that transition is the umbrella term for all the services and supports that schools and VRS must have available to students with disabilities. Pre-ETS is just one portion of those overall transition services. So let's review the definition of transition next. Take a moment to think about what transition means to you. You may have come up with any number of things, and if we were all together, it'd be nice to share some of that. But one thing for sure, if you are new in your role as a pre-ETS representative, you're obviously in transition right now. Here is the official definition of transition from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. The words that stand out to me are passage, movement, development, and evolution. Also, going from one form or stage to another. More specifically, when we talk about transition for youth with disabilities, we are talking about the time when adolescents are moving into adulthood and are planning for post-secondary education, careers, healthcare, financial benefits, housing, and more. It is also about interagency work to ensure that there is a continuation of services across both child and adult service systems. And all of us have transitioned from high school to adulthood, and so I'm sure that you can agree that preparation for the next step in life is so critical for every young person, but especially youth with disabilities who may have more support needs. I think it's interesting to note that at the federal level, special education and rehabilitation services are sister agencies at the U.S. Department of Education. They are within the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, otherwise known as OSERS. So it's no coincidence that both of our federal laws, IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and WIOA, define transition the same. And they also both require that education and vocational rehabilitation address transition in collaboration with each other. So in case you're not familiar, IDEA requires students in Minnesota to have transition services called out on an annually updated Individualized Education Program, or IEP, starting in grade 9, so about age 14, and until they graduate, which could be as late as 21. Here is the IDEA definition of transition services. It says that they are a coordinated set of activities that facilitate the movement from high school to adulthood. And WIOA, again, defines transition in the very same way. So again, pre-ETS are a component of transition services, and schools provide them to students as a part of what's included in their IEP. Schools also provide them to students through personal learning plans, or PLPs, which are required for all students in Minnesota, and I'm going to review PLPs next. And then VRS provides them to students eligible for VR as a broader transition service on the employment plan. And of course, we provide them to students who are potentially eligible for VR. Here's another way of looking at where pre-ETS fits in the big picture. So all students in high school receive general education, of course. Next, students that need more support to be successful may receive special ed services, and they may also receive VR intensive services. And then the third circle represents transition services as being a part of special ed and VR services. And lastly, pre-ETS are a part of those overall transition services. And keep in mind that schools are the primary provider of pre-employment transition services, and that VRS is to fill in the gaps. In other words, it's going to be important for VRS to do their best to understand how students are already getting or have access to supports at their school as the first level of service. So I said I would come back to personal learning plans, or PLPs. Minnesota passed legislation in 2013 that requires the PLP for all students starting in grade 9. This plan is to be updated at least once a year, but the hope is that they're engaging in activities related to PLPs throughout the year. These activities include academic scheduling related to career goals, career exploration, the building of career and employment-related skills, community partnerships, college access, as well as access to other forms of post-secondary training, and lastly, experiential learning opportunities, which we would call work-based learning. So many schools are already doing many things related to pre-ETS, and so again, you're going to want to ask them, what do they have in place related to PLP? And also keep in mind that students in special ed are allowed to have their IEP act as the PLP, but that still doesn't mean that they shouldn't be included in all school PLP-related activities. This slide reviews how the PLP legislation and pre-ETS language align to help you when you have conversations with school staff about what career development structures are already in place for students and how pre-ETS can align with that structure. And here's one last picture of thinking of our overall system. So think of pre-ETS as a pathway that's available to students. There are many opportunities to get the support they need to be successful. And no matter which services students receive, it is all about them reaching the ultimate goal of competitive integrated employment. So that is the end of training module number 1. You can contact your RAM if you have any questions. And again, feel free to reach out anytime to me as well. Thank you.